The unexpected act of kindness. Laura stood in line at the crowded grocery store, her hands shaking slightly as she glanced at the total on the cashier's screen. She had been careful, but somehow she had forgotten her wallet at home. Her stomach sank as the cashier repeated the amount. $56.45, the cashier said, looking up at her with a polite smile. Laura's heart raced. She knew she had enough cash in her wallet to pay for the groceries she had carefully picked out, but now she was empty-handed, her face flushed with embarrassment. She quickly looked through her purse once again, hoping to find a forgotten dollar or some loose change, but it was no use. Her wallet was sitting on her kitchen counter, left behind in the rush to leave the house earlier that day. "I'm so sorry," Laura said, her voice barely a whisper. She felt a lump form in her throat as she began to gather her bags to leave the store. She didn't want to make a scene, but the frustration of the situation was overwhelming. She couldn't believe it. She had been so careful, and now she was in this embarrassing situation. She had to leave the store and come back later. But just as she started to walk away, she heard a voice from behind her. "Don't worry about it." Laura turned to see a man standing there, his shopping cart full of items, smiling at her gently. His face was kind, with a weathered yet calm look about him. He looked like he had seen many things in life, both good and bad, but still held on to hope. "I'll pay for it," he said, not waiting for her to respond. He pulled out his wallet and handed the cashier a few bills. "It's no trouble at all." Laura blinked in disbelief. "Wait. What? No, I can't let you do that." The man smiled and shook his head. "It's fine. Really, it's no trouble at all. You can pay me back another time. Just do me a favor and pass it on when you get the chance." Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a rush of gratitude. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She had never experienced anything like this before. Who was this man? Why would he be so generous? The cashier handed her the groceries, and Laura took a moment to catch her breath. She felt both humbled and amazed by the stranger's kindness. She looked at him again, wanting to thank him properly, but before she could say anything more, the man had already turned and was walking away. He didn't look back, and Laura felt a sudden sense of longing. She wanted to know more about him. She wanted to understand why he had chosen to help her when he didn't have to. "Thank you," she whispered to his retreating figure, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. She left the store, her mind racing. As she walked to her car, she replayed the moment over and over again in her head. She was so used to being independent and self-sufficient, but here was a stranger, a person she had never met before, doing something so kind without asking for anything in return. It made her wonder about the world. Why do people help others like that? What motivates them? Was it just random kindness, or was there a deeper meaning behind it? Laura knew she would never forget this moment. It wasn't just about the groceries. It was about the unexpected connection she had experienced with someone who had no reason to be kind to her, yet chose to be. She wanted to thank him again, but there was no way to reach him. He had disappeared too quickly. He had simply come into her life for a brief moment, left his mark, and then vanished. For the next few days, Laura thought about the stranger constantly. She found herself thinking of ways she could repay him. Could she go back to the store and ask around? Would anyone know who he was? But she wasn't sure it would do any good. The man had acted so anonymously, and she respected that. He didn't do it for recognition or reward. As the days passed, life went on. Laura settled back into her routine, but the memory of the stranger lingered in the back of her mind. She found herself looking for kindness in the world around her, hoping to see more acts like the one she had experienced. It seemed that the stranger's actions had somehow opened her eyes to the possibility of kindness in a way she hadn't considered before. Little did Laura know, that small act of kindness would come to mean so much more in the years ahead. And the man who had helped her, his name, his story, and the reason behind his gesture, would eventually be revealed in ways she could never have imagined. The unlikely connection. A few years had passed since the day Laura had received the stranger's unexpected help at the grocery store. She had never forgotten the moment. It stayed with her, like a small glowing ember in the back of her mind, reminding her of the kindness that still existed in the world. But life had moved on. Laura had her own family now, a husband named David, and a young daughter, Emily. They had settled into a comfortable routine in their suburban home, and the incident with the stranger had slowly faded into the background of her busy life. However, one quiet afternoon, Laura found herself cleaning out her attic, a task she had been putting off for months. The boxes were filled with old clothes, holiday decorations, and forgotten keepsakes from the past. As she dug through the dusty boxes, she stumbled upon an old shoebox, taped up and marked with the words for David. Curious, Laura opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, photographs, and one peculiar item: a cassette tape. The tape was in an old, worn-out case with no labels. Laura wasn't sure what to make of it. She remembered David mentioning something about an old cassette recorder he had used when he was younger, but she never thought much of it. Why was this tape in the box marked for him? The box also contained a few faded photographs of David when he was a child. Laura paused for a moment, glancing over them, before her attention returned to the cassette tape. She wondered if there was something special about it. Could it be a recording from David's past? Something he had forgotten about? She couldn't help but feel a sense of intrigue. Maybe it would offer some insight into a part of David's life that she didn't know about. She walked down to the living room, where the family's old cassette player sat on a shelf. After dusting it off, she placed the tape inside. As the tape began to play, the first sound she heard was a muffled voice. It was a man's voice, but it didn't belong to David. It took a moment for her to realize. It was the voice of the stranger who had paid for her groceries years ago. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice on the tape spoke slowly, almost as if the words were being carefully chosen. "This is for Laura," the voice said. "If you're listening to this, then it means you found the tape. I hope you're okay, and I hope this brings you some answers. I owe you more than just a few groceries. There's something you need to know." Laura's hands trembled as she sat down on the couch. Her mind raced. What was this? Why was the stranger's voice on this tape, and why was it directed at her? The voice continued, telling a story she never expected to hear. "I'm sorry for the secrecy," the voice said. "I never wanted you to know who I really was, but you deserve the truth. My name is Thomas, and I'm afraid our paths were never meant to cross by chance. There's something I've been keeping from you." Laura's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew she had to keep listening. Her curiosity was now uncontrollable. Who was this man? What did he mean by our paths were never meant to cross by chance? The tape continued, and Thomas began to explain. He told Laura about his life, about his connection to David, and about a secret he had been hiding for many years. A secret that would change everything she thought she knew about the man she had married. As the tape played on, Laura felt a growing sense of disbelief. She hadn't expected any of this. The stranger, Thomas, wasn't just a kind soul who had helped her in a moment of need. He was tied to her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. The more she listened, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in ways that seemed impossible. Thomas explained that years ago, he had been a close friend of David's father. They had both been involved in a life-changing event that had caused them to drift apart. But in the years since, Thomas had kept a watchful eye on Laura. From a distance, he had seen her struggles, her joys, and her hardships. And when he saw her in that grocery store all those years ago, he had made a decision. He had paid for her groceries not just out of kindness, but because he felt he owed her something far more important than money. And now he was asking for her forgiveness. Laura's mind was spinning. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had no idea who Thomas really was or why he had kept such a secret for so long. What was it about her family, that had led him to take such actions? And what was the connection to David's father? The tape ended with a final, heartfelt message. I hope you understand, Laura. I know this is a lot to take in, but I promise I did what I thought was right. Please don't tell David. Not yet. I need you to find me, to ask me the questions you have. I'll be waiting. The tape clicked off, leaving Laura in stunned silence. The secret connection. Laura's hands shook as she stared at the cassette tape, the final words of Thomas echoing in her mind. Please don't tell David. Not yet. I need you to find me, to ask me the questions you have. I'll be waiting. Her pulse quickened. The mystery of the stranger from the grocery store had just deepened into something far more complex. Thomas, the man who had helped her years ago, wasn't just a kind stranger. He had a connection to her family, one that she hadn't known existed. What did he mean by asking her not to tell David? And why was he now asking her to find him? Laura's thoughts swirled as she sat in the quiet of her living room. She glanced at the clock. It was late, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to act immediately. She needed to know more about Thomas, about why he was keeping such a secret. Her mind raced back to the time when she had met him. She remembered him as a quiet, mysterious figure who had smiled at her with a kindness she hadn't expected. But that was it. She never thought she'd see him again, let alone hear his voice years later, revealing things about her husband's past. Taking a deep breath, Laura stood up, grabbed her coat, and headed to her car. She didn't even stop to think about what she was doing. All she knew was that she needed to find Thomas. She needed to ask him the questions he had left unanswered on the tape. The drive felt like it took forever. Laura's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as her mind raced through possibilities. What kind of secret had Thomas been hiding all these years? And why had he decided to reach out to her now? She had so many questions, and she didn't know where to start. But she knew she had to keep going. After what seemed like hours, Laura arrived at the address Thomas had left on the tape. It was a small, unassuming house at the edge of town, tucked away behind a row of trees. She hesitated for a moment, her nerves creeping up on her. What if Thomas wasn't there? What if the whole thing was a mistake? But then she remembered the last words of the tape. I'll be waiting. With a deep breath, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The door creaked open, and Laura was greeted by an older man with graying hair and a kind smile. It was Thomas. You came, he said softly, as if he had been waiting for her all this time. Laura didn't know what to say. She felt overwhelmed, her mind still reeling from the shock of hearing his voice on the tape. But she found the strength to speak. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. Why didn't you tell me all of this sooner? Why did you leave that tape for me? What is the connection between you and my family? Thomas stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. Please, come in. There's a lot to explain, and I'm afraid I don't have much time. Laura hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The house was simple, with old photographs lining the walls and soft lighting casting a warm glow on the room. It felt like a place full of memories, and it was clear that Thomas had lived here for many years. But as she glanced around, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. Thomas led her to a chair and sat across from her. He took a deep breath, as if he were gathering the courage to speak. I've known your husband, David, for a long time, he began, but I didn't know him the way you do. We both went through something in our youth, something that changed everything for us, something that I've kept hidden for years. And it's a part of that past that I need to tell you about. Laura's heart pounded. She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. What happened? What does any of this have to do with David? Thomas looked at her with a mixture of sadness and regret. It's a long story, but I'll try to make it as clear as I can. David's father and I were well, let's just say we were in a situation that forced us to make some very difficult choices. Choices that changed the course of both our lives. We promised each other we'd never speak of it again. But when I saw you in the store that day, I realized that I had to do something. I couldn't let it go on any longer. Laura's mind raced. She was still trying to process everything he was saying. Her husband's father. What did that have to do with her? Why had Thomas been keeping all of this a secret? Thomas continued, David doesn't know the full story. He never did. And he doesn't know that I've been keeping an eye on you both all these years. But I had to do it. I had to keep an eye on you because you were a part of something much bigger than you realized. A part of a story that involves not just me, but your husband's father and, well, other people who may not want you to know the truth. Laura's breath caught in her throat. What truth? What are you talking about? Thomas stood up, his hands trembling slightly. The truth that David's father was involved in something dangerous. And I've been trying to protect you both from the fallout ever since. Laura sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She couldn't make sense of it all. David's father involved in something dangerous. What was Thomas talking about? And why hadn't David ever mentioned any of this? David deserves to know the truth, Thomas said quietly, his voice filled with sorrow. But it's up to you when the time is right. I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. The room fell silent. Laura didn't know what to say. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about David, was suddenly being turned upside down. She had come for answers, but now she was left with even more questions, and the only thing she could do was wait for the truth to unfold, uncovering the past. Laura's mind was spinning as she sat in Thomas's dimly lit living room. His words echoed in her head, each sentence like a heavy stone dropped into the calm waters of her life. The shocking revelation about David's father, the man she had trusted all these years, had turned her world upside down. She was no longer sure of who to trust. And now, standing in front of Thomas, she was grappling with a new question. What had she missed all these years? Thomas's face was weary, his eyes darkened with a kind of sorrow she could feel in her bones. He was waiting for her response, but Laura couldn't find the words. She had so many questions, but they all seemed to freeze in her throat. Do you understand now? Thomas asked, his voice soft yet urgent. David doesn't know everything about his father. He doesn't know the dark side of the man who raised him. Laura struggled to comprehend it all. David's father, the kind and loving man she had known for years, had been involved in something dangerous. She couldn't picture it. She remembered David's father as someone who had always been there for his son, always supportive and understanding. It didn't make sense. Why didn't David ever know about this? Laura managed to ask, her voice trembling. Why would you keep it from him? From me? Thomas's face twisted with pain. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was meant to stay buried. But the past doesn't stay hidden forever, Laura. And now it's coming back to haunt us all. Laura sat back in her chair, trying to steady her breath. Her mind raced through all the possible scenarios, but none of them seemed to fit. What could be so dangerous that Thomas had felt the need to protect David and her for so long? And why now? What had changed? Thomas stood up and walked to a dusty bookshelf against the far wall. He pulled down an old leather-bound journal and handed it to Laura. This belonged to David's father. It's the key to everything. But be careful with it. It's full of things he never wanted anyone to find. Laura hesitated but took the journal from his hands. It felt heavier than she expected, as though it carried not only the weight of the pages inside, but also the burden of years of secrets. She ran her fingers over the cover, the rough texture of the worn leather beneath her fingertips. It seemed ordinary, but Laura knew it wasn't. Why didn't you tell David? Why are you telling me now? Laura asked, still trying to piece it all together. Thomas paused, as if searching for the right words. Because now it's your turn to decide what to do with it. You need to know the truth, Laura. I can't protect you forever. And when the time comes, David will need to know too. Laura's stomach tightened at the thought of her husband facing this truth. Could she really tell them? Was she ready to face the consequences of whatever secrets his father had hidden away for all these years? Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts. You need to understand. This isn't just about you and David. This goes deeper. There are people who would do anything to make sure this never comes to light. The weight of his words sank in, and the room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker with the gravity of the situation. Laura's hands shook as she opened the journal to the first page. It was written in a careful, looping script, but the words blurred in front of her eyes as the reality of what Thomas had said settled into her bones. She read the first few lines out loud, barely hearing her own voice as it echoed in the quiet room. To my son David, I'm writing this because I know you'll never understand the choices I made. I did what I had to do to protect you. Her voice trailed off as she tried to make sense of the words. What did this mean? What had David's father done that was so dangerous? Thomas sat back down in his chair, his gaze fixed on her as she read. You can't ignore this, Laura. You have to know what your husband's father was involved in. The danger isn't just in the past. It's very much alive. Laura's pulse quickened. She could feel the walls closing in around her, but she also felt an urgency. Whatever was in that journal, whatever secrets it contained, she couldn't turn back now. The past was here, and it was demanding to be known. I don't know if I can do this, Laura whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Thomas's expression softened. You have to, for your own sake, and for David's. If you don't, the consequences could be far worse than anything you've imagined. Laura's fingers trembled as she turned the next page of the journal. The words became more detailed, describing events and names she didn't recognize. But one thing was clear. David's father had been a part of something much larger and more dangerous than anyone could have realized. And now, those forces were closing in on them. I'll help you, Thomas said, his voice firm. But you have to be ready for what you'll find. This is just the beginning. The air seemed to grow colder as Laura looked at the journal, the path ahead uncertain. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back. She had stepped into a world of secrets, and she had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The hidden threat. The weight of the journal seemed to increase as Laura turned the pages, each one revealing more than she was prepared to face. Her heart beat faster with each passing moment as she realized just how deep David's father's secrets ran. What started as a story of past choices now felt like a warning, a ticking clock she couldn't ignore. She glanced up from the journal, meeting Thomas's gaze. His face was pale, his jaw tight with worry. It was clear that he had already seen enough of what was in the journal. He had lived through it, and now, as the bearer of this heavy truth, he was watching her struggle with it. But she wasn't sure she could continue down this path. How much of this was he involved in? Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked away, his fingers running through his hair in frustration. David's father wasn't just a bystander, Laura. He was involved in things that no one should be involved in. Things that put him, and everyone around him, in danger. Laura's mind reeled with confusion and fear. She had known David's father as a kind, hard-working man, someone who would do anything for his family. She couldn't reconcile this image with the man described in the journal, someone tangled in a web of dangerous secrets and betrayal. As her eyes scanned the pages, a name kept appearing. The Order. Laura couldn't understand what it meant, but it was clear from the context that the Order was something dangerous, something that had once been a part of David's father's life, in ways she didn't even want to imagine. Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts. The Order, it was a secret group of powerful people, people who would do anything to protect their interests. David's father, he was a part of it, a key part. Laura felt a chill creep up her spine. The more she read, the more she understood that the danger wasn't over, it was only beginning. David's father had tried to leave the Order behind, but they wouldn't let him. They never let anyone leave once they were involved. David's father knew too much, Thomas continued. And that knowledge, it was dangerous. Not just to him, but to his family as well. That's why he kept it all a secret. He thought if he kept his head down, if he didn't rock the boat, he could keep you and David safe. The more Laura heard, the more she felt like the walls were closing in on her. She had always known that life had its risks, but she had never imagined that something so dark, so twisted, could have been hiding just beneath the surface of her peaceful family life. The more she read, the clearer it became that the threat was not just in the past. It was coming for them. "You said the order would come after us," Laura said, trying to steady her voice. "What does that mean? What are they going to do?" Thomas swallowed hard, looking away again as if the truth was too much for him to bear. "They'll do whatever it takes to silence anyone who knows too much. And now that you've found the journal, it's only a matter of time before they come for you too." The words hit Laura like a cold wave, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Her mind flashed to David, to the life they had built together. And she knew she couldn't let him get dragged into this. She couldn't let him become part of a dangerous game that he never asked for. "David doesn't know any of this, does he?" Laura asked, her voice shaking. Thomas shook his head, his face full of regret. "No, he doesn't. And I'm afraid it's too late to protect him from it now. Once the order knows someone knows their secrets, they'll stop at nothing to eliminate the threat." Laura closed the journal and placed it on the table in front of her. Her hands trembled as she thought about David, her husband, the man she loved, who had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes of their quiet life. It was clear now that whatever peace they had enjoyed up until this moment had been an illusion. "We need to tell them," Laura said, her voice firm with a new resolve. "We have to tell David the truth." Thomas's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "You can't. If you tell him, you'll be putting him directly in danger. The order will come after him with everything they have. You need to understand that, Laura. You can't protect him if you make him a target." But Laura wasn't backing down. "I can't keep this from him. He deserves to know what's going on, even if it means he's in danger. We're in this together, Thomas. I won't keep him in the dark." Thomas sighed heavily, and for a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but he didn't. He understood, perhaps more than anyone, the weight of the decision Laura was about to make. "Fine," he said quietly. "But understand this. Once you tell them, there's no turning back. The game changes. Everything changes." Laura nodded. She had already made up her mind. It wasn't just about protecting David anymore. It was about finding a way to fight back, to reclaim control over their lives, to break free from the shadow of the order and the darkness that had followed them for so long. As she stared at the journal in front of her, she realized that the stakes had never been higher. The secrets of the past had a way of bleeding into the present, and now it was up to Laura to figure out how to fight back before it was too late. The unseen enemy. The decision was made. Laura couldn't go back now. She had to tell David everything. But the moment she thought about confronting him, her stomach twisted in knots. It wasn't just the fear of how he would react. It was the weight of the consequences, knowing that the truth would drag them both into a battle they never chose. It was one thing to uncover the journal and face the harsh realities within it, but it was entirely another to bring that darkness into her home. To drag David into a world of shadows, a world where the order operated without mercy. She couldn't protect him from the truth, but she could try to protect him from the full force of the order's reach. David had been away on a business trip for the past few days, and Laura had used the time to process the overwhelming flood of information in the journal. But now, as the day of his return drew closer, the anxiety began to settle in her chest like a heavy stone. What if she couldn't make him understand the severity of the situation? What if he refused to believe it? What if it was too late? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Laura froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Who could it be at this hour? It was too late for a regular visit, and the only person she expected was David. But something in her gut told her this wasn't a casual knock. She hesitated for a moment, then went to the door. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, in the dim light of the hallway, was a tall figure dressed in a dark suit. He looked out of place, almost like he wasn't supposed to be here. His eyes, cold and calculating, met hers with unsettling calm. "Mrs. Richardson," the man said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of something sinister. "We need to talk." Laura's mind raced. She had no idea who this man was, but she knew in her gut, that this was no coincidence. The man standing in her doorway wasn't just a stranger. He was connected to the order. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements deliberate, as if he were measuring her reaction. "We know you've been looking through certain things," he said, his words soft, yet filled with a veiled threat. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Mrs. Richardson, dangerous ground indeed." Her heart raced as the full weight of the situation hit her. This wasn't just about the journal anymore. This wasn't just about David's father's past. They knew. The order knew that she had discovered the truth, and now they were here to make sure she didn't share it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Laura lied, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped back, trying to distance herself from the man, but he was quicker, blocking her way with a swift movement. "I think you do," he said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "And I think you're going to regret trying to uncover things that should have stayed buried." Laura's mind raced. She couldn't show weakness. She couldn't let him know how scared she truly was. The order was dangerous. She had read enough to know that. But she couldn't back down now. Not when David's safety, and their future, was at stake. "I don't know what you want," Laura said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "But I will tell David everything. He deserves to know the truth." The man's expression shifted, just slightly. And for a moment, Laura thought she saw something like amusement flicker in his cold eyes. "Oh, I'm sure you think that," he said. "But the truth, Mrs. Richardson, is much more complicated than you think. And if you continue on this path, you may find that you're not just putting yourself in danger. You're putting your husband and your son in the same position." Laura froze. Her heart stopped for a split second as the weight of his words sank in. Her family was already in danger, but now it seemed like they were directly in the crosshairs. The man's warning wasn't just a threat. It was a statement of fact. "You don't have to do this," he continued, his voice lowering as if to strike a final blow. "There's still time for you to turn back. Forget everything you've read. Forget the journal. Forget that David's father was involved with the order." The silence that followed was deafening. Laura stared at him, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore it now. She couldn't just pretend it didn't matter. The stakes were too high. But she also couldn't deny the fear rising in her chest. The reality was sinking in faster than she could process. The danger wasn't just out there somewhere. It was right here, at her door, waiting for her to make a choice. "I can't," Laura whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't forget. David deserves to know the truth, and I won't let anyone hurt my family." The man's expression hardened, the amusement fading from his face. "That's your choice, Mrs. Richardson. But know this, you may have just sealed your fate, and that of your family." With those chilling words, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he disappeared into the night. Laura stood frozen at the door for several long moments, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of what had just happened sank in, and she felt the fear settle over her like a heavy blanket. But there was no going back now. She had made a choice. The truth would come out, no matter the consequences. As she closed the door and locked it behind her, she realized something that she hadn't fully understood before. The order wasn't just some shadowy group from the past. They were here, in the present, and they were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. And Laura's discovery had just made her their next target. The final choice. Laura sat alone in the darkened living room, her hands trembling as she held the journal close to her chest. Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm. The warning from the man, the stranger who had knocked on her door just hours before, still echoed in her mind. He had made it clear that there was no turning back. The order had noticed her. They had noticed her digging into secrets that were buried deep, secrets tied to David's father. And they had made it clear that she was crossing a line that should never have been crossed. She had always known that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy, but she never expected it to be this dangerous. The order had a reach far beyond anything she could have imagined. They were powerful, elusive, and dangerous. And now, with her family at risk, she felt more trapped than ever. David was due to come home from his business trip tomorrow. He had no idea what had happened while he was gone. He had no idea that everything was about to change, that their lives were about to be upended by the truth. Laura's heart ached at the thought of what it might do to him, but she knew there was no other choice. The truth had to come out. But was it really worth the risk? The journal in her hands was a heavy burden, filled with secrets that could shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband's family. The man who had come to her door had been clear. If she continued, if she insisted on telling David everything, there would be consequences. The order wouldn't stop until they silenced her, until they erased any trace of the past she was digging up. She thought about David, about their life together, their plans for the future. He was a good man, kind, compassionate, the kind of man who would never believe something like the order could exist, let alone that his own father had been involved with them. How could she possibly explain this to him? How could she make him understand the danger they were in without losing him forever? And then there was Ben, her teenage son. He was already too young to understand the depth of what was happening. She didn't want to drag him into this mess. He deserved to grow up without fear, without knowing that there were forces working in the shadows, plotting against them. Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she thought of all the things that were at stake. Her family, her future, everything she had worked so hard for. It was all hanging by a thread, and every decision she made from here on out would determine the path they would take. She reached for her phone, staring at it for a long moment. She thought about calling David, telling him everything now, before it was too late. But what if he didn't believe her? What if she ruined their relationship? What if he thought she was crazy? She didn't know if she could bear losing him, not after everything they had been through. Her phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a text from David. "I'm on my way home. Can't wait to see you. Love you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't been expecting the message, and it only made the weight of the situation heavier. He didn't know. He didn't know that his world was about to be torn apart. And she was the one who had to do it. She knew she couldn't keep hiding the truth. The time had come. She had to face it. She had to tell him everything. The door opened with a soft creak, and Laura turned to see David standing there, a suitcase in hand, a smile on his face. His tired eyes lit up when they saw her, and for a brief moment, all the fear and anxiety that had been consuming her heart seemed to melt away. He was here. He was safe. But she knew that would change, that everything would change once she told him what she had uncovered. "Hey," David said, walking toward her, his smile fading as he saw the look on her face. "You okay?" Laura swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was convincing anyone, least of all herself. "Yeah, just been thinking." David set his suitcase down and reached for her hand. "Come here," he said gently, pulling her into an embrace. "You're scaring me. What's going on?" The weight of it all came crashing down on her, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all too much. How could she possibly explain the terror that had been creeping into their lives? How could she put into words the things she had learned? But as David held her, she felt the strength to speak, to finally face the truth. "I found something, David," she whispered, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "Something about your father. About the order." David's face hardened at the mention of his father, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "They're not just a name in a journal, David. They're real. They're dangerous. And I think they're after us now." David stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to process what she had said. But then his expression softened, and he took her hands in his. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quietly, his voice tinged with worry. "But I believe you. We'll face this together. We'll figure it out." Laura nodded, feeling the surge of relief mixed with the fear that still gripped her heart. But she knew, in that moment, that this was it. The final choice had been made. She couldn't undo it now. All she could do was move forward, face whatever came next, and hope that together they could survive whatever the order had in store.